This is continuing coverage. The Black Swan murder trial of Ashley Benefield from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Now back to the courtroom.
There's the jury. So the attorneys and I need to talk about what's going to happen next week. We got to do some legal matters that are outside the province of the jury. So at this point, I'm going to let you go for the weekend. It's about 10 till 4, so you're free to go at this point. Remember the rules for the weekend. Please do not discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't talk about it with anybody else outside of the jury. And certainly don't do any research on the people, places, things, or legal topics you've heard anything about. And that includes being very mindful of watching out for any media that may be on anywhere you go and wherever you might be to avoid all of that. Okay? Listen, do you still have your parking passes?
Yes.
Everybody's got that. If you've lost your sticker, is there somebody downstairs in the jury room? Okay. Oh, you got a bunch of them?
Yes, he got us a bunch.
It's like pads and everything. We got them everywhere. Okay, great. So make sure you keep that parking pass. If something happens and you lose it, you're going to have to come in Monday, see the jury coordinator to get another one, and then go park, because they will give you a ticket or tow you, one or the other. All right. So thank you very much. It's been a great week. Yes, ma'am.
What time do you want us here Monday?
I always forget that part. We're going to start at 9 o'clock on Monday. So if you can be downstairs, 8:30, 8:45 is just fine. Listen, I will say this, though. Remember on this past Monday how there was a whole bunch of people? That's how it's going to be this coming Monday, because we're going to be picking another round. Other judges are going to be picking other rounds of juries. So you don't have to necessarily stick together, but you're probably going to want to be off a little bit. Unless you want to tell the other folks there how great jury duty is. That way they won't try and get out of it. All right. Great question. I'm sorry I forgot about that. Thank you very much. You are free to go for the weekend.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, you all can have a seat. I will tell you, I don't think I need to hear a whole lot more about Mr. Ferris. I think we've talked about it quite a bit. We're ready for the hearing. I will say this, it is a hearing, so if you want to make an opening, don't feel like you can't. You're absolutely free to make an opening if you want, Mr. Taylor. Please don't let me dissuade you. If you want to make an opening, make an opening.
Not necessary.
State?
No, Judge.
Thank you.
I think we've talked about it.
Mr. Ferris? Face the clerk, raise your right hand this morning.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Hello, sir. My name is Judge White. I'm presiding over the case. We're going to have a Daubert hearing. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yes, sir.
So just put yourself about 12 to 15 inches from that microphone. Make yourself comfortable in that chair.
Okay.
And we'll get started with the hearing.
All right.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Tell us your full name, please, and spell your last name.
Bruce Eric Ferris. Last name's Ferris.
Mr. Ferris, what type of work do you do?
I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I do individual therapy, and also I do consulting on domestic violence and expert witness testimony.
Let's discuss your education. Would you inform us, please?
Sure. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in civil engineering. I also graduated at the local police academy in Gainesville, and I have a master's degree in mental health counseling.
Do you have any specialized education or training in a specific field?
I do. If you look at my curriculum vitae, I think there's over 100 items listed for either classes or seminars or teachings and certificate training that I've attended.
And included in that, would domestic violence be a major part of it?
That was the definitely predominant theme of whether it be a specific class or a conference, et cetera, on domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And if you'd like, I can explain the difference.
Please.
Domestic violence has to do with what we might think of people have a child in common or family members. And that doesn't necessarily mean an intimate relationship. It could be two relatives living in the house together. Intimate partner means there's an intimate relationship, a spouse, a boyfriend, girlfriend, so there's a little difference there.
Try to make sure your
Okay.
voice in the microphone because it tails
Sure.
off.
Thank you.
Mr. Ferris, have you taught any courses or presentations in specialized field?
I have.
Please enlighten us.
If you look at my CV, I've given, I think, over 40-some presentations and teachings. For 8 years, I taught a batterers intervention program class to offenders, uniquely that. And for anyone that doesn't know, batterers intervention program is for offenders. It's usually court-ordered, part of probation or part of a sentence or part of an injunction or a restraining order. It's a 6-month psychoeducational class. I've been trained for that and teach that. I also I used to teach garnered litem volunteers about domestic violence and effects on children. I taught the 8th Circuit staff at the state attorney's office about domestic violence and impact to women and children, and batterers intervention, how to interview people. From 2008 to 2020, I taught at the University of Florida Law Clinic on intimate partner violence to law students about the same type of subject, domestic violence and intimate partner violence and effects, and also enforcement of the law. I also trained police officers about domestic violence enforcement. Currently, since 2009, I've been teaching officers how to de-escalate confrontations as part of the crisis intervention training team. I teach the de-escalation part of that. There's a lot more I could talk about, but that's the nature, and you could see in my CV.
All right, let's talk about your work experience.
Okay, so I have an affiliation with Village Counseling Center, doing therapy, DCF cases, and domestic violence-related cases. I used to also work with Creative Counseling in Gainesville, doing teaching batterers intervention program classes and doing individual therapy. I also have my own practice now, and I do individual counseling. Recently, I just looked up, since 2014, I've treated almost 1,000 individual clients or patients as an individual therapist. Work experience we're still talking about.
Yes, sir.
Okay, of course, I mentioned the doing consulting for attorneys on domestic violence and being an expert witness. You're gonna want to know my current work or my past work?
Well, let's stay in the past. How about any experience with the Gainesville, Florida Police Department?
Yes. I went through the police academy in 1993. I was sworn in 1994. I retired from there in 2013. The last 10 years of my career there, I was the lead detective in the domestic violence unit, part of the Investigations Bureau, uniquely just looking at domestic violence cases, enforcing the law, training officers, doing some public outreach, and being on various task forces.
Can you give us an idea over the course of that time, approximately how many cases you would have handled?
Yeah, I was a lead detective on close to at least 500 cases I looked up were resulting in arrest or charges being filed.
And what kind of professional credentials do you hold?
I'm a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida. I have certification to teach batterers intervention program classes through the state. I also received certificates to do threat assessments, domestic violence threat assessments through Jackie Campbell at Johns Hopkins University. Also trained in doing counseling and work with adoptions through Rutgers University.
Have you been the recipient of various awards and recognitions?
Yes, I have. I was chosen by the Alachua Board of Commissioners to be recommended to Governor DeSantis to be on the Alachua County Child Fund, tax fund, I guess they call it, trust fund, excuse me. I've also received various awards as the for my domestic violence work through the local shelter. I received a statewide award from Attorney General Pam Bondi and Governor Scott at the time for my work. In 2010, I was awarded and recognized for my work with victims of crimes in the state. There's several other ones. Without looking at my CV, I don't recall them all.
Sure.
I received some recognition of contributions for the work I did with that CIT team. The University of Florida also gave me recognition for training that I'd done with their officers. I was Big Brother of the Year, and for my work with my little brother for about 10 years, I worked with a little kid as my friend, and I was also the Law Enforcement Officer of the Year as granted by the Domestic Violence Abuse Network in Gainesville.
Are you a member, Mr. Ferris, of any specialty boards, committees, or professional organizations?
Sure. Again, relying a little bit on my CV because of the nature of the question.
That's fine.
So in 2022 to 2024, I was a member of the Rape Crisis Center Advisory Council. I was a member of the American Mental Health Counselors Association, a retired member of the Fraternal Order of Police. I was a member of the 8th Judicial Circuit Florida Family Law Advisory Group, member of the Gainesville Domestic Violence Task Force. I was a member of the 8th Judicial Circuit of Florida Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team. I was a board member of the Gainesville Commission on the Status of Women, member of Alachua County High Risk Domestic Violence. I got some recognition for my work as a volunteer with University of Florida College of Medicine. I was doing mobile outreach part-time as a volunteer. I was a member of the University of Florida Male Leadership Committee, again dealing with domestic violence. I was also on the planning committee for the Sexual Battery Conference in Gainesville for many years. I was a member of the Gainesville Mental Health Consortium, the United Way Community-Wide Strategic Planning Safety Committee. I was part of the working group for leader for Domestic Violence Coordinated Community Response for local law enforcement and best practices procedure. And I was a member of the statewide Domestic Violence Needs Assessment Group organized by the Office of State Courts Administrator, Office of Court Improvements.
Have you been recognized as an expert by courts in Florida? An expert in domestic violence?
Yes. Just as a footnote, I've been recognized as an expert in domestic violence, intervention program class, effects of domestic violence on children, and generalized mental health work. I've been involved with about 60 cases, consulting or testifying. Not all of those did I testify. I did testify in over 50 of those cases.
Both civil and criminal?
Yes, both civil and criminal. Majority were in civil. The types of working both for the defense and the prosecutor of the state attorney's office, but the majority were civil.
All right. Would you be kind enough to educate us a little bit? What is domestic violence?
Okay. Domestic violence, domestic violence, according to Florida state criminal law, is acts of like battery and assault, ag battery, ag assault, false imprisonment, sexual battery, all these different person crimes from one family or household member to another family or household member. So that now the definition is what's a family or household member, and that's people that are married, living together, maybe had a child together, but have never lived together. People living together as a family in a house. It doesn't include, let's say, cousins that never lived together. So it's unique in that way.
And is there another definition of domestic violence?
Yes, and in my practice and in my training, this is a pretty accepted concept, that domestic violence is actually a pattern of power and control. And the key word is pattern, that's repetitive. And the criminal definitions, the physical things, those are used by perpetrators or abusers to control their victims. But along with that also is used, we often think about emotional abuse or those sorts of things, and they're defined in the Duluth Power and Control Wheel.
Would you explain to us what the Duluth Power and Control Wheel is?
Okay. So the Duluth Power and Control Wheel was developed up in Duluth, Minnesota by a group of researchers who deal with domestic violence. And what they did is they looked specifically at domestic violence cases that have been criminal cases, that victims who came through shelters, DV shelters, and they were looking for what were the tendencies or the tactics used by abusers against their victims. And they developed this power and control wheel used around the country. It's the Duluth Power and Control Wheel is the basis for the Batter's Intervention Program class I mentioned. DCF, Department of Children and Families, has accepted that as a reality, a fact, and that was the criteria or the curriculum for the BIP class used statewide and actually used around the country and internationally. So there's these 8 inner items side of the depiction. I don't know if...
All right, yeah, let's see if, Judge, with court's permission, we put the screen.
Yeah, probably a little bit so we can see. That's perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Judge, may I ask you a question? Could I stand over here?
Sure.
Rather than try to do it from the seat?
Reposition as you need. It's just us.
Okay, thank you. It's just a little easier to see this way for me.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Judge.
Oh, you know what though? The only thing is you can't be so far that the court reporter can't hear you. And she's listening to these microphones.
Okay.
So why don't you turn that,
Okay,
and then if you just position so you're facing there.
okay. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, there we
Can
go.
you hear me now?
Yes.
How does this work? Change it, I'm going to reach out, so just push. Okay. Okay, so you can see that.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's
Yeah,
get
sure.
you a little
Judge, thanks for reminding me. So this is the Duluth, as I said, if you look here, Domestic Abuse Intervention Project. And this was established, I don't know, maybe 30-some years ago, 30, 40 years ago. And this is the standard used around the country and used for the Batter's Intervention Program class and a lot of counseling I do. And this is part of the counseling along with cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the therapies I've been trained in graduate school and my work. So on the outside here of domestic violence is physical violence and sexual violence. And that's covered in the state statutes, the criminal law statutes. Then there's these 8 items that are part of the power and control. And remember, I said it's a pattern of power and control. So that means it's repetitive, a way to get your, it's a way for the abuser to get their victim to comply, to get into a compliance mode. I'll talk about that in a moment. So the first item is using intimidation, making her afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying her property, abusing pets, and displaying weapons. Those are I run into this all the time in terms of intimidation. Using emotional abuse, putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy. It's very common. Playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel guilty. Using isolation, controlling what she does, where she goes, who she sees, oftentimes spying on their victims, checking their phones, tracking them, etc. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. I find this in almost all the cases I work. They make light of the abuse, say it didn't happen, they shift responsibility. It didn't happen, it wasn't that bad, it was your fault. So minimizing, denying, blaming. Using children, sometimes put their victim, the mom, in fear of what he'll do to the child, or that he'll report her, etc., that she might lose the child. Male privilege, this has to do with the role that he makes the decisions in the family or in the relationship, and gives her a specific role. Economic abuse, this would maybe be preventing her from having a job or money, or she should have an allowance, etc. And then the last item is using coercion and threats, or I'm just having problems reading the fuzz here a little bit, making and carrying out threats against her, threatening her to leave, using coercion and threats. So I'm going to sit here, that can stay up, and I'm going to make a few comments about it. So the main issue here that, as we understand the power and control wheel, is these are techniques that the abuser uses to control their victim. And like we say, it's a pattern, so that means it's repetitive. And so what's the purpose of that? It's to get them to comply. And so the victim ends up trying to avoid the perceived danger that they'll experience if the abuser perceives that they're opposing them. Particularly true for mothers that are, not only are they trying to protect themselves, but they're protecting their children. And I found that there's victims of domestic violence tend to get into what I call an equilibrium sort of stasis experience. In other words, they avoid the perceived threat, so they, the proverbial, the old phrase of walking on eggshells, so they end up being in this compliance, kind of like they don't want to poke the bear, so to speak, so they find this narrow way of coping by going along with the perpetrator and don't want to make him angry at them, because that's when the violence occurs, or the threats, or the emotional, the hardship. And that's exactly what the perpetrator, the abuser, wants to happen. He wants to keep her in line, so usually to manipulate, to get her to do what he wants to do, that they feel a sense of ownership, and they use these techniques to control. They also, the victim wants to appear to be going along. They don't want to anger him. They'll actively hide this from family and society, because if it gets out, he's going to be mad. I could speak certainly a lot more about that.
Are there, Mr. Ferris, common characteristics that abusers share?
Yes, they could be anyone from any socioeconomic I've been involved as a therapist and as a detective enforcing the law with all types of society and sexual orientation, from wealthy, well-known NASA scientists, doctors as a perpetrator to the homeless person and everyone in between. And in Gainesville, where I worked, we have a great population from all around the world there, and I didn't find a difference other than sometimes attitude, but every socioeconomic group, it's very, and also they tend to be males, but females also. Just yesterday, I took on a new client, spoke to him. His wife's in jail. He has 4 children with her, and he's a victim. So, he's a victim. So there's female abusers and male abusers. Males are predominant. I know when I was working, I ran some statistics on cases, and I found it was about over 2/3 of my cases were males and 1/3 were females. And some of those, and that kind of reflected also when people would, kind of want to debate that issue about men or women. One thing that always struck me is when you realities, the statistics are about the same. Usually the murderers are mostly men by about 2/3 over the women. So the actual victimization cases and then the actual fatality cases, kind of the statistics I found ran together.
And what do they have in common?
Usually that they want to control their partners. There's kind of an ownership attitude. They use the power and control techniques I described to do that. I also find that they're missing true empathy. I've kind of nicknamed it to myself as they're missing an empathy gene. And empathy has to do with the ability to feel feelings. And I find the perpetrators that I've counseled and also worked with in the BIP class, and certainly in my police career, they tend to be very selfish, narcissistic sort of ideas. I kind of image it as many of them, not 100%, but a majority. It's kind of like their point of view is I'm here and everyone and everything around me relates to me. I'm the center of the universe. As opposed to a healthy relationship, there's an equality. I'm being thoughtful and considerate of my wife as she is for me, and there's some balance. They don't necessarily adhere to that. They disguise how they treat their victims. Usually they don't want to let other people know about that, much like the isolation element. They want to keep it. And there's reasons for that. And some of it has to do, they don't want to go to jail if it gets out. And then they don't want, I found this a lot, that perpetrators don't want their victims to get the idea that they're not a good deal, that there's something they're doing that's wrong, so they isolate them from society as such. And they'll put on a real front. I have numerous cases like this, how they treat their victims. There can be, the victims, the perpetrators, can oftentimes be very appealing, and they're very good at convincing people of things. I found a certain finesse amongst those thousands of BIP clients I had, that there were some very good talkers. I'll just leave it like that. But emotional abuse is certainly what we think of. I've certainly worked a lot of cases where there was, broken bones and bruises, etc., and emotional abuse and isolation and coercion threats, etc. But many of the cases I see, there isn't acute violence. It's emotional abuse. It's these techniques. The question is, can the abuser convince the victim that they're and put them in fear so they adhere to what they say? If they can create the fear, like this one lady told me, she was in fear of him so much, they would be in a public place and they're separated and they're across the room, and if he saw her talking to a male, he looked at her and she knew right away, end the conversation, move on. There was a fear, and there was no violence in that relationship, but she was scared of him. Also, as we know, as Judge knows, and Mr. Taylor and the ASA knows, battery, in the state of Florida, there's assault and there's battery. Battery is the unwanted touching, that's the hitting, the punching, etc. But assault is also a crime. That's being in proximity to someone, showing a threat. I'm bowing up, I have my fists up, and the victim has a perception that the violence is going to occur. That's a crime. No marks, there's no scar, but there's fear. And so sometimes there's assaults that are taking place that aren't reported. And if on top of that, if they can create that to go along, that's a common technique that I see happening. It's all about keeping control of their victim. And one real common thing that I've seen is obsessive jealousy. And when I worked with batterers, I was surprised, and I came to learn very quickly that they oftentimes equate jealousy with love. And we all know jealousy can be very detrimental to the object of the jealousy, and also to the person having the jealousy, being obsessed and worried, etc. Love, we all know, is something else, completely different, very kind, considerate, and very empathetic, very different, but they didn't understand that dynamic.
Let me ask you, Mr. Ferris, do they exhibit, with respect to these characteristics in common, is their behavior relative to animals, pets in particular? Domestic pets.
Yeah, I
dogs,
understand.
cats.
So cats, dogs, etc. So there's above average abuse of pets by domestic violence abusers. So I have two explanations for that. One is what I talked about, their missing empathy, that they don't feel for a dog or a cat like I might feel. I'm very empathetic. I am in love with Rosie, my poodle. So is my wife, so that means a lot to me. But to an abuser who doesn't have empathy, it's not a big deal for them. They see it as an object. That's one thing. The more important item, especially in terms of power and control, has to do with that. It gets back to the controlling of their victim. If that victim is attached to that pet and I abuse that pet, now I'm putting you in fear for what I'm doing because I'm hurting your animal. So I'll attack that pet as a way to control you. You better not, oppose me again, or you better not leave, or you better not go out with your girlfriends when I say you shouldn't, or I'm going to hurt your pet. I'm going to kill your pet even. So it becomes part of the continuum of power and control. And the sad part is I've also found that many perpetrators have that same mentality they use against the females, children, in the sense that the women are highly protective of the children, and so he's using the child as a way to gain control over the female.
And what about the abused, Mr. Ferris? Do they have common characteristics as well?
Yes, the majority are female, though, like I say, I treat male victims of domestic violence also. I'm still kind of surprised at times when I meet a new victim for the first time. And remember, for 13 years, I've been getting clients from our local DV shelter as a consultant and a therapist working. So I get kind of a constant feed of them. And then I also have my other sources and attorneys, and just my people know who I am, so they come to me if they're victims. But I'm always amazed at how many don't truly know what domestic violence is. And even I've had I've had clients who don't think they're a victim of domestic violence. They'll know the problem, but they haven't been, I'm refraining from being too graphic because I've seen it all in terms of broken bones and types of violence in families. So they haven't been violently attacked and hit with the 2x4 or something. But I go over the power and control wheel, and they say, holy cow, this is my life. This is what's been going on with me. I remember one crime scene I was at, and had been a victim of domestic violence, and she wouldn't talk to us. And I had a moment to speak to her, and I showed her the power and control wheel and had a moment. There was a victim advocate there too, and we went over it, and all of a sudden it was like an aha moment, and she goes, darn. And I think it was a strangulation case, and she realized, and I've had some specialty training and some certification about being an expert in strangulation with the state, another subject, but she realized that she came within 4 minutes of dying for lack of oxygen to her brain, and once she realized the power and control wheel and how dangerous it was, she opened up and shared information, and that suspect who had left was eventually found. Also, statistics show that domestic violence victims will leave, on the average, about 8 times they'll leave their perpetrator before they finally leave. It often happens. And there's also socioeconomic and ethnic groups that have unique attitudes to domestic violence. This protecting a child for the mother as a characteristic is very, very significant. I guess I'll take a short moment. There was a particular case that comes to mind. This mother was very abused by her husband, and he made her stay.
Narrative, I think he's established this fact.
Sustained. To the narrative.
Okay,
so you want me to skip the story?
Yeah.
Sure.
All right. Describe what coercive control in a relationship means.
Coercive control are acts of assault, threats, humiliation. You're trying to create harm, punishment to frighten the victim, much in the manner that we're talking about a pattern of power and control. By creating fear, it's all working towards controlling the victim. Of course, like I say, the power and control wheel is the tactics, along with physical violence and sexual violence. And then we get into that appeasement or compliance that I've talked about. They want to avoid the pain of the conflict. And pain can be emotional pain. I've had women tell me, I rather get slapped upside the head, excuse me for the phrase, but then be told I'm ugly or fat, or my self-esteem totally crumbled. And so don't underestimate how important emotional control is in that sense.
Do these offenders always behave violently, or does abusive behavior happen in cycles?
No, as I've explained, it's not always violence. It's perceived violence in terms of the threats are enough to create fear in a victim that because of some assaults or, like in using intimidation, making her afraid by looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying property, displaying weapons. These are all acts of intimidation that affects them and can create a great fear, and because of the narrative they project, the reality that they're living as the victim, and they get into this compliance mode, and it's can be very dangerous. There is, in terms of cycles in the industry, I'll call it, we recognize there can be kind of this rain, sunshine sort of model, that there's acute abuse, and that's kind of symbolic of it raining. And then the sun comes out and there's like a honeymoon phase with couples, and the sun, everything's nice, there's no violence or no emotional abuse, and then all that rain with the hot sun, clouds form again, and then the clouds are too heavy to carry the rain, and then it rains again. So there's in some relationships, not all, but there's this cycle of violence or emotional abuse, and then a honeymoon. There's also a generational cycle that I'm aware of, that you grow up in a family where roles are very defined. The male is the head of the household, the wife doesn't, oppose him. So sometimes that cycle goes, I see it in my clients, from generation to generation until it can get someone breaks free from that. And maybe that male realizes that's not the best role to have, and a female realizes, I don't deserve this, and they move on. So that's another cycle.
Does the victim, Mr. Ferris, always appear to be afraid or act like they are afraid of the offender?
Definitely not. This gets back to what I've already been talking about. They're hiding that fear from friends, families, and for good reason, in the sense of the consequences of laying it out. And they may not understand all what's going on with domestic violence, but sometimes I've had victims say that they deserved it, that they caused the violence, that they didn't keep the house clean enough. They've got almost a brainwashing going on about what's expected of them as a woman, and they found this I'll call it a dissociation from the facts, a mental health term, kind of an avoidance that allows them to comply because of their fear. And so it becomes, no, it doesn't, they don't always appear to be afraid.
So let me ask you this. How common is it for the victims to smile and act happy?
I think we've gotten far afield from what needs to be established under dollar. As far as domestic violence, I'll stipulate he has this knowledge as to domestic violence at this point, but I think we've gotten far afield of what needs to be established.
Judge, I might recall for the court that they played the video of them all in the restaurant.
I'm not sustaining. I mean, this is your proffer, so
Yeah,
you
thank you.
You tell me what you want me to know about your expert, and I'll decide what he can say and not at trial.
Thank you. Would you elaborate on how common it is for the victim to smile and act happy?
Very common. And it speaks to what I've already been discussing, that they try to hide the abuse from others sometimes for personal reasons. They don't want him to get in trouble. I've had mothers that are financially dependent, and they don't want him to go to jail or prison because how will they take care of their kids? So they sacrifice themselves. They are afraid of, what society is going to say, or they're afraid of the abuser. So especially the afraid of the abuser is a really big part, and that they stay in line. And again, it speaks to this idea of compliance or equilibrium, as I call it, find the lowest resistance to survive. And so they get into survival mode, and that walking on eggshells. And as a therapist, when victims come to me, we've got to kind of untangle this stress and trauma and come to terms with that, because they've gotten kind of in this lifestyle of compliance and all the hurt that comes with that, and how their self-esteem's been damaged. I could go on and on with that subject.
All right, so tell us a bit, if you would, Mr. Ferris, the role that appeasement plays in domestic violence.
It plays a huge role. We could say appeasement, we could call it compliance, we could call it walking on eggshells, we could call it don't poke the bear.
Go along, get along.
Go along, get along. It's all about avoiding pain. And that's the very technique, the fear, I'll use fear as equivalent to pain, that is a way to control, hence why this is called the power and control wheel. These are techniques, along with physical violence, that are used to control the victim and get them. And there's an ownership, I've already mentioned, a certain ownership, a jealousy, etc. And also I found some of my abusers become obsessed with their partner, that ownership quality at all costs, and they're just highly obsessed, and it can get rigorous. Actually, I've worked cases where there's been suicide, homicide, that if I can't have you, nobody can have it. And if a victim realizes that their perpetrator's capable of hurting them, they're going to go along, or they're going to get on a jet and fly somewhere real far away.
All right, tell us, if you would, what the impact of a child has on these dynamics.
So the impact to the child, or having a child in the scenario?
Having a child in the mix.
A huge impact. I found who, certainly that want to protect themselves and do this compliance, but when there's a child involved, and if they have a strong maternal instinct, they're going to sacrifice themselves to stay in a relationship. I've worked many cases, to my surprise, where there was no reporting of the violence or domestic abuse occurring. And so the woman, the mother, wouldn't seek a divorce, because they knew, typically in our state, if there's no extreme reason, criminal history, drug history, violence, etc., it's going to be a 50-50 custody. So I've had women who have stayed in the relationship, taking the abuse, because she's so concerned that she wouldn't want her child to be alone with that perpetrator. She sees him as a brute or a bad role model, etc.
And might that type of a scenario play out with the woman acting happy in an effort to go along and be in the company of the abuser to protect her child.
Without a doubt, that's the whole scenario, and and there are women that are better at it, more sophisticated at it than others. I'm just finished working a case where her family, as I interviewed, I won't make this long, but there was abuse. He's in prison. She was pregnant. She gave birth while he's in prison. She stayed with him. A couple years later, she was running his business while he's in prison. She finds out he's getting out early in 3 months. She commits suicide. She hangs herself because she was so afraid of him coming back. The grandparents, the maternal grandparents, have the child. I'm working on that custody issue and the criminal cause. But the point I'm making is that when I interviewed the parents, the sister, the friends, all these people before the suicide occurred, they didn't know how bad the relationship was. She wouldn't show up to family gatherings, or she'd come and go, or they wouldn't see him. She was totally hiding all that extreme abuse that she was going through. The family didn't know about it till the end, before he was charged and went to jail. So she went to great lengths to hide because she was scared of him. And I believe her going along with him and running the business was all out of fear also. And then she couldn't face it and decided to leave us.
A few questions, if I can, as it relates to domestic violence abusers. What have you found in your experience and education as it relates to their ability to charm and deceive others?
Yes, I found this in a majority of the cases. They want to project an image, again, hide the abuse. Sometimes that's their strategy to deceive others because they don't want to be found out. Also, I might add that the recidivism rate, when I was running the VIP classes, I was always surprised. I'm getting the same guy back again. That there's a personality issue here that hasn't been solved per se with some men, and that there's a tendency to abuse over and over.
Is there a unique pattern of denying, rationalizing, minimizing, or blaming the victim that's typical?
It's not only typical, it's in a majority of the cases that I've ever worked. I see this almost in all the cases, I'll say. And if we look at the Duluth power and control wheel, there's actually, at 5 o'clock, minimizing, denying, and blaming. It didn't happen. It wasn't that bad. It was her fault, which, as I've explained in the past. So that's very typical. It's also a form of gaslighting that's been in, I think, the news the last 10 years or something. So it's a form of control and gaslighting victim.
Does it include suggesting that the problem stems from the victim's mental health problems?
Definitely. That's a very common theme. It's also gaslighting, and also it's in the power and control wheel using emotional abuse. About the third line down, making her think she's crazy. So it's a destabilizing technique. If you've got so much influence over me that you convince me that I'm crazy, then maybe it didn't happen. Maybe I'm wrong. So it's a self-esteem killer.
Give us an idea, if you would, of the barriers that exist to these women leaving the abusers.
Fear of being harmed, certainly, if they report to victims. Barriers to leaving can be, as I mentioned, cultural upbringings or norms, roles. A lot of victims are financially dependent upon their perpetrators and don't know what else to do, and they don't necessarily have any other resources. Sometimes when I do trainings, I confront my audience, especially when I've got law enforcement or victim advocates, about their expectations of victims leaving that, perpetrator. You expect her to walk out on the street with 4 kids and she doesn't have a credit card and no family, and I kind of go into this a little deeper. I'll avoid doing that now. The fear of losing her children. So sometimes victims have experience with DCF. They understand what can be consequences if it's reported to DCF. So they don't want to report because, and I've been party to this in a lot of cases and termination of parental rights cases I've been involved with that if she's staying with the abuser and a child, and like I mentioned, I taught a class for DCF to men and fathers and mothers, and also trained on this a lot, that exposure to a child to trauma is trauma to that children. Separate from the traditional child abuse that we think of hitting the child or not changing the child's diaper, not having food, but actually subjecting the child to the yelling, the screaming, the abuse is trauma to that child. So if a female doesn't report and she's found out, then that can be considered a failure to protect. Now all of a sudden, and she's still a bona fide victim. So now she's being held accountable. Her children might be removed. She's got to go see people like Bruce Ferris for counseling. She's got to do all these classes. So there's and many know this, so they don't want that to be out and about. Also, sometimes I've had women, they still love him. They see the good in him. They feel he didn't have a good childhood, or it doesn't happen often, or maybe I created the problem.
So you mean these aren't split-second decisions?
What specifically?
Do they vacillate sometimes when children are involved?
No.
Should I leave? Should I stay?
I like to think it was an evolution to leaving. But what's the motivation? If you're in that isolated situation of just he's the one, he's your world, where's the education? Where's the involvement? That's what the role of a lot of our domestic violence shelters are in outreach, and is to involve and educate, and yes, here's services you can have, here's someplace you can safely go. But that denial that violence will happen again is not uncommon. That feeling that it was her fault. Religious reasons. I'm always kind of surprised that, and I mean no ill towards any religious group. I don't mean to say that, but I found sometimes ministers or churches, very concerned about marriages and not getting divorced, and they actually recommend or counsel people to stay together that are hurting each other. And so that's an issue. This idea that he will hurt her if she leaves, in this quote, I'd rather see you dead than with someone else, is not uncommon. And also the total power and control continuum and the use of that to control their partners.
Is there a particular time in these kinds of abusive relationships when violence is most likely?
Definitely. The most violent time is when she goes to leave and he knows about it, or he's there.
In other words, when he forms the perception that the realization sets in that this is the end.
When she eventually puts her foot down and makes that clear, and I know from my certification is doing fatality reviews with Johns Hopkins University, that's in danger assessments, there's a high probability of fatalities or extreme bodily harm at that time. It's very dangerous. When we do many shelters and victim advocates that might be affiliated with the state attorney's office or wherever, they try to establish a safety plan with victims, and that plan will include, when you leave, it's when he's not home. Don't do it when he's home, and also have a safe, unknown location to go to. I have many stories I could tell of women being hunted down and actually killed because of he knew where they were. And that just the trauma of that. I don't, even though I work in this field and I've been doing it for 20 years, it's hard for me to conceive that cloud over me of being subjected to being violently hurt. And if I am, who's going to raise my child? And will he hurt my child also? It's overwhelming for those victims. And I certainly see that in my practice, my counseling practice.
So let me ask you this as we close. Given your education and experience as a law enforcement officer, tell me, is there a general bias against females by males?
I think there is some different social, ethnic groups, different cultures. Like I think I mentioned earlier, ownership of women. I've had, without mentioning the countries, I've been in, like I say, Gainesville is a little stewing pot of people from all over the world. I've run into men who actually thought it was okay to abuse their wife because they thought she belonged to him. And I said, sir, this is America. That's not how it works. So this ownership can be cultural. It can be dictated by social norms, what their parents did. Certainly the media and entertainment plays a big part towards women and male roles in our society.
And where can this bias be found?
Everywhere.
Everywhere,
In society.
including our institutions?
Including institutions.
And would those institutions include law enforcement?
Law enforcement, and of course I worked in law enforcement, and I was always surprised at how I constantly had to, I actually became a little internal affairs detective for my officers who didn't understand domestic violence and had biases, and I was always surprised of the biases and found sometimes they were personal. An officer's going through a divorce, so all of a sudden he's at a crime scene and he treats the female badly because of his own world, not enforcing the law appropriately. But yes, it can be, not, and also not everyone reacts the same way as a victim to domestic violence, and especially with other people. Some people have developed a very fat affect. In other words, they don't show emotion, and that's their coping skill. They actually shut down. They do this dissociative sort of thing. Other people become hysterical and exaggerated in describing. So every person is different. Just because you...
Non-responsive to the question.
Sustained.
All right. Lastly, do uninformed professionals, in your experience, cops, judges, lawyers, counselors, often fail to recognize the signs of domestic violence?
They do, and sometimes it's because they're not obvious and they're hidden, or they don't understand the dynamic of domestic violence, and they don't necessarily understand that that victim was in fear. And though it may not show, they may be smiling in a photo, or their family or someone doesn't know about it. That doesn't necessarily speak to what was going on.
All right. Now, would you be able to relate these principles to the facts of a domestic violence case with any kind of reliability?
100%.
Have you done that before?
Routinely.
Is that what you in fact do as a professional?
It's one of the major things I do. I might put as a footnote, I'm a therapist. So sometimes clients come to me and I'm helping them with their anxiety and their depression and generalized mental health issues. But many of my clients, because I focus on domestic violence, I'm helping them understand, or the perpetrators, I'm helping them change their attitudes, usually through what I call cognitive behavioral therapy, and I could go on and on.
All right. Could you make that application and its reliability by studying the facts and documents relative to a particular case?
Actually, this is one of my professions.
All right.
I'm hired by the state for cases doing domestic violence assessments, and sometimes I never get to interview some of the parties. Maybe they're not available, they're in prison, etc. In private practice, and also, like I say, through DCF, I've been hired. So I look at the characteristics, what fits, what was there a display of a weapon, was there all these different things. And
would you be able to do the same application with the same reliability through a series of hypothetical questions?
Certainly.
All right.
And if I can, I would admit that I can.
Yep. Finally, let's talk about battered spouse syndrome for a moment. Are there any characteristics in traditional battered spouse syndrome that might distinguish it from an otherwise domestic violence abusive situation?
Good question. So basically, the abuse is the same. I think what makes battered spouse syndrome or battered wife syndrome, different terms through the years, different is oftentimes the victim still lives with the abuser, and there can be a history of extreme violence or violence occurring and traumatizing the victim. But the techniques of power and control and compliance and fear and how they hide it and all those things are completely the same.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Ross?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Have you ever testified as an expert on battered spouse syndrome?
No, I have not.
Do you consider yourself an expert on battered spouse syndrome?
I consider myself an expert on domestic violence, not necessarily the BSS uniquely. I haven't been recognized by a judge in that, doing that.
So no.
I think that for me, there's really no difference other than that distinguishing fact, whether they live there or not, or whether there's been physical violence or not. It's still the same dynamic. The victims are the same.
But you could recognize that the law might make a distinction between those two things,
I
an
can.
expertise in those two things.
Well, I think I'm expert enough to understand that. I just haven't testified uniquely in DSS.
And did you speak to Miss Benefield?
I did speak to her.
And for how long?
I spoke to her multiple times with a Zoom call.
Okay, my question was how long? How much time did you spend speaking to her?
It varied a little bit for an hour. Most of the times it was 2 hours.
Okay, I need you to add it up. Did you speak to her 1 hour total, 3 hours total?
Oh, total time?
Yes, yes, sir. I'm sorry if my question wasn't clear.
Going just by memory, I'd be guessing a little bit here, so I apologize. Could have been. I'm just trying to. Could have been 15 to 20 hours easily.
So you spent 15 to 20 hours speaking to Miss Benefield?
I did.
Okay. And did you review paperwork in this case?
A lot. That's how I came to my conclusions, uniquely from the paperwork.
When you say uniquely from the paperwork, are you telling this court that you spent 15 to 20 hours with Miss Benefield, but you didn't base the opinions that you gave previously in a depo on that time?
That's true. I did not do an assessment of her. I was not hired to do an assessment. I did not produce an assessment.
Well, what were you doing for 15 to 20 hours?
Some of it was being a counselor, and some of it was I have a reputation to keep, and I wanted to understand was this really a victim? So kind of got into a routine of understanding some timeline with her about what occurred and how to fit the facts that I was reading about.
Well, wouldn't that say, if what you just said is you needed to determine if she was a real victim, then it must have come into your decision-making about this case, with that assessment you made. Is that correct?
Could you restate the question,
Well,
please?
you just testified that you spent 15 to 20 hours with Miss Benefield, and part of that was to make an assessment on whether or not she was a real victim. And
No,
so,
not to make an assessment, as I compared the facts that I knew from what I was reading, I wanted some validity, and then some of my time was being empathetic and listening to her. But my conclusions I've come to that I talk about in the deposition were 100% from the discovery. Those were the items, and I could list them for you if you'd like.
did they include the stand your ground motion filed by Mr. Taylor and the defendant?
At the time, that was one of the items. Certainly, if I subtract that from what the things he quotes in the Stand Your Ground were other discovery items. Doug admitting to shooting the gun into the ceiling, him telling that to his priest, and phone calls and texts. So I didn't need the Stand Your Ground paperwork document to find all those bits of information that I found through looking at discovery.
Well, so the portions of the stand your ground about what happened that night were not in discovery. That Mr. Benefield took a bladed stance and did this.
No, I did that. Those items were not part of my conclusion. I could tell you I have 13 items I use uniquely in discovery that it came to my conclusion on, and it didn't include. And I never spoke to Ms. Benefield about what you just said about bladed stance. I never talked to her about that.
Well, you said you spoke to her to determine if she was to determine her veracity. Is that what you're trying to say?
That's one word, but I never spoke to her about the event of the shooting. Never.
Did you speak to her about the other things that were in the stand your ground hearing and the discovery from things that had occurred in the past?
I think some of the things did. Yes. As I think about, as she's going, basically where she I did some timeline understanding, when they met up until before the event, and some of those items were in there.
And did you develop an opinion as to whether or not Ms. Benefield was a battered spouse? Like, as far as battered spouse syndrome, if you would say that she suffered from battered spouse syndrome?
Yeah, I did not determine that. I determined that she was a victim of domestic violence and that Doug was the perpetrator of that.
Based on
all the discovery and how it fits in with the continuum of power and control and her compliance, her fear, etc.
I don't have anything else, Judge. Thanks. Thank you, sir.
Tell us what you were.
I reviewed a deposition that Doug gave, and I had a written version. He makes admissions. He talks about the gunshot. He talks about punching the dog, throwing the gun, punching holes in the wall. There was a letter to his pastor where Doug admits punching a hole in the wall and shooting the gun in the ceiling. There was a domestic violence injunction in South Carolina prohibiting mutual contact, and the text of that. A really important piece of evidence for me was Ashley wrote a letter on September 18th, 2017, when she separated, outlining domestic violence that Doug did to her. I have a copy of that if you want me to go through the items, but she outlines, without necessarily being a domestic violence counselor at all, she talks, it all fits very discreetly into what power and control and what abused women experience at the hands of their abusers. It was, and also for me, if I might say, that was a frozen moment in time. That wasn't something that she said after I met her or something like that. This was from 2017.
And were you struck by the terms of basically art that she unwittingly included in that letter as it relates to domestic violence and the power and continuum?
It was, it's a letter that I can use in training other people to counsel domestic violence victims, or if I was to work with a group of batterers, etc. It's classic.
Okay, what else did you?
Deposition of a neighbor who caught Doug at night in the yard. A text of Doug admitting to putting a tracker on Ashley's car. I mean, these items that show ownership, stalking sort of items. A text from his ex-wife documenting him physically abusing her on her honeymoon. So this gets into his character, and
I have a question for you, not his opinion about them.
That's fine. Go ahead. Overruled.
Thank you, Judge. Go ahead.
So here I have all this experience dealing with perpetrators, being a perpetrator to multiple victims. Sometimes when I was a detective, I would, besides my therapy work, and I see that as I interview victims, but quite often my routine, I work day shift. So I come into the department, I go to a detective briefing, I look at cases where the suspect got away. My job was to review probable cause, go make the arrest, or get the warrant. That's what I did. So the first thing I do is I run that perpetrator's name, and I find out there's an injunction, and I'm looking at the charging document that an officer left, and there's no violation of injunction in there. But then I open it up in the court system, and I found it's a different victim. So I found these multiple victims. And also, to be fair, I'd open up her, the female, the victim's information, and I would find that there's an injunction, but it was with a different guy. So there's some serial victims, some serial offenders. So basically, the fact that he is very strong, and I know we talked about it in my deposition with the assistant state attorney, this text message from his ex-wife documenting how he abused her on a honeymoon it was appalling to me, but it was not an unknown probability, and also it spoke to who am I looking at here. So that was one item. If I could continue. Of course, there was an injunction in Manatee County and some narrative. Dr. Russell, a forensic psychosocial mental health evaluation, I think it was April 30th, 2020. She describes the abuse and domestic violence that Doug did against Ashley quite eloquently. It's quite clear the things she discovered in she did interview and come to that conclusion. So I found that kind of enlightening. There were telephone calls and documentation between Doug and Ashley. I've got a date of August 16, 2019, where he was, controlling, intimidating, admits to being outside her house, following her. He was gaslighting her. He pulled a gun on his ex. There was a threat that he was going to kill himself with a gun, and there was more. There's more in that without pulling out the document. There was a very significant WhatsApp phone messages between Ashley and Doug, and in that there's statements about being armed. He talks about warfare, rage, exterminating them, murderous mood, anger to take them out, a warrior side would be, the testosterone rage, talks about killing bad people. So let's say we could say, was this all true, or was this techniques that to put her in fear of him? Both could be true, actually. I found that very, Dr. Broder, I read his testimony that he gave, and it was clearly domestic violence was present. There was definitely power and control tactics reviewed by him. The mic blow up, the gun incident was, and I have a quote here, was certainly a frightening frightening experience for Ashley, yelling, screaming, punching holes in walls. And Mr. Taylor's cross was in that transcript I read. And as you spoke to Dr. Broder, angry temper, very controlling, highly manipulative, very intense. The holes punched in the wall, fired a gun in the ceiling. That, there was an appeasement. That word was even used by Ashley, apparently by Dr. Broder, as a strategy with Doug to protect her child, keep him at bay. This is the very issues I've been talking about. There was text about him kicking the dog and throwing the cat between Ashley and Doug. So all these elements right here, I got my conclusion from. I didn't need anything else. And this is clearly what I base my determination on.
And would you conclude, based on what you know, that Ashley was an abused woman?
Definitely.
Would you?
And I'm going to interrupt you, Mr. Taylor. Abused woman is to say one thing, but who was in compliance mode, that didn't want to poke the bear, that was afraid of what might happen if she opposed him. That's what I get here.
And how, if at all, would that explain, for example, Ashley agreeing to go on a parental exchange between Doug Benefield and her daughter, Emerson. Ashley, in the week leading up to the shooting, exchanging friendly, lovey-dovey text messages with emojis and things like that. And Ashley at a restaurant with her mother and her child, Emerson, in the company of Doug, acting happy.
Totally, it doesn't oppose my theory at all, or what I believe was going on. It may be that there's one thing I can say. Ashley did show, from what I've read here and what you're presenting to me, a sophistication to, and maybe that's her performance side for being a ballerina or whatever, I don't know. But she could put up a good front. And this was to keep that warrior side of Doug at bay. She was concerned and afraid, and she was very afraid for her daughter. This is the mother factor. Her getting in that, I guess, you referred to the first visitation.
Yes, at the sheriff's office.
Her going along, that's much like I talked about that wife that stays with the abuser to protect the child. The idea of letting him, have custody at that time without, and I don't think, if I remember from documents I read, they didn't have that. He didn't have a lot of exposure to Emerson. And so, yeah, that was definitely the mother, the maternal instinct, wanting to protect her daughter and at her own expense. But that's nothing. I just, I'm a parent. I take a bullet for my kid. It's not about me. It's about protecting them. I think that mothers do that. That's what mothers do.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ferris.
Mr. Ferris, it's always a little bit dangerous when the court has questions, because certainly I'm the neutral party. But in this kind of situation in a Daubert, I'm both the finder of fact and the decider of the law. So there are a couple of questions I have. I've said this multiple times. Mr. Taylor, I probably said it in hearings with you. I know you two have heard it. If you object to one of my questions, object. Please put your objection on the record. I have actually sustained objections against my own questions before. So I try to be intellectually honest, and if it's in retrospect, I realize that's not a good question.
You have been good about that, Judge.
First, I did not receive a copy of your CV.
More continuing coverage is on the way. The Black Swan murder trial of Ashley Benefield from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Press subscribe now.